The summer sun was just beginning to soften in the sky when the first guests started arriving at the Hendersons' backyard. It was one of those perfect June evenings where everything felt just right. The air was warm but not too hot, and a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees that lined their property. Margaret Henderson had been planning this party for weeks, and looking around at her decorated garden, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Paper lanterns hung from tree branches, casting a soft glow as evening approached. Tables covered in white linen were scattered across the lawn, each one topped with fresh flowers from her own garden. This wasn't just any party. The Hendersons threw this gathering every year, and it had become something of a tradition in their quiet Connecticut neighborhood. Friends, neighbors, colleagues, even the mailman had gotten an invitation this year. It was Margaret's way of bringing people together, of creating those rare moments when busy lives could pause and people could actually talk to each other without rushing off somewhere. But this year was special for another reason. Sitting prominently on their covered patio was a beautiful grand piano, its black surface gleaming in the late afternoon light. Robert Henderson had spent months restoring it. He'd found the old Steinway in an estate sale, covered in dust and desperately out of tune. It had been built in the 1920s, and Robert, who had always loved pianos, even though he wasn't particularly talented at playing them, couldn't resist bringing it home. Margaret had rolled her eyes at first. Another project, she'd thought. But watching her husband carefully restore each key, polish the wood, and finally have it professionally tuned, she'd come to appreciate his dedication. Now the piano sat waiting, and Margaret knew Robert was itching to show it off. He'd positioned it perfectly on the patio where everyone could see it, where it could be the centerpiece of the evening. She smiled to herself. Her husband was like a kid sometimes, so excited about the simplest things. As more guests arrived, the party found its rhythm. Wine flowed freely. The smell of grilled vegetables and seasoned chicken drifted from the barbecue. Conversations overlapped in that pleasant way they do at good parties, creating a background hum of human connection. Children chased each other around the lawn while adults caught up on neighborhood gossip, work stories, and summer vacation plans. Among the arriving guests was a young woman named Linda Chen, who worked in Margaret's office. She came with her grandmother, a small elderly woman who moved slowly and deliberately, holding Linda's arm for support. The grandmother's name was Helen, though she'd been born with a different name in a different country many years ago. She was in her late 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing a floral print dress that looked like it had been carefully preserved from another decade. Margaret greeted them warmly at the garden gate. Linda she knew well, a bright and capable young woman who'd recently joined their accounting firm. But this was the first time Margaret had met Linda's grandmother. The elderly woman smiled politely, but said little. Her eyes were kind but distant, taking in the party scene with the expression of someone watching life from slightly outside of it. My grandmother just moved here from Oregon, Linda explained, speaking a bit louder than necessary. Though whether Helen was hard of hearing or simply preferred silence, Margaret couldn't tell. She's staying with me now. I hope it's okay that I brought her, of course, Margaret said, genuinely pleased. The more the merrier. Please, make yourselves comfortable. There's food and drinks over there, and help yourselves to anything. Linda guided her grandmother to a quiet corner of the garden, where there was a comfortable bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. Helen settled there with a small nod of thanks, her hands folded in her lap, watching the party unfold around her. She seemed content to observe rather than participate, and Linda, after making sure her grandmother was comfortable, drifted off to chat with other young people from the office. The party continued to build momentum as the sun sank lower. Someone turned on music from a portable speaker, though it was kept low enough that conversations could continue easily. Margaret moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had what they needed, introducing people who didn't know each other, being the perfect host. Eventually, as she knew he would, Robert made his way to the piano. He couldn't resist. Several guests gathered around as he sat down and launched into a cheerful, if somewhat clumsy, version of Piano Man. People clapped along, some singing the words they remembered. Robert was grinning, clearly enjoying himself despite hitting more than a few wrong notes. But that was the beauty of it. This wasn't a concert hall. Nobody expected perfection. It was just people having fun. After Robert finished two enthusiastic applause, others wanted their turn. Tom, from down the street, who'd had a few glasses of wine, attempted chopsticks and got everyone laughing when he couldn't quite coordinate his fingers. Carol, who taught elementary school music, played a medley of Beatles songs that got several people singing along. A teenager, the daughter of one of the neighbors, actually played a simplified version of a pop song she'd been learning from YouTube. Tutorials. The piano became the heart of the party. People gathered around it, drinks in hand, encouraging whoever was playing, laughing at mistakes, clapping at the end of each piece. It created exactly the kind of atmosphere Margaret had hoped for. That feeling of community and shared joy that seemed harder and harder to find these days. Through it all, Helen remained on her bench in the corner. A few people had tried to engage her in conversation, but the language barrier made it difficult. She spoke very little English, and though she smiled and nodded politely, it was clear she couldn't really participate in the discussions happening around her. Linda checked on her periodically, making sure she had something to drink, asking if she wanted to leave. But Helen shook her head each time. She seemed content to simply sit and watch, her eyes following the movements of the party with a gentle, slightly melancholy expression. Margaret noticed Helen sitting alone and felt a pang of guilt. In the bustle of hosting, she'd neglected to make sure everyone felt included. The elderly woman had been sitting by herself for nearly 2 hours now. That wouldn't do. Margaret prided herself on making everyone feel welcome in her home. She caught Linda's eye and gestured toward her grandmother. Linda made her way over, and Margaret joined them by the bench. "Is your grandmother enjoying herself?" Margaret asked. Though looking at Helen's isolated position, she suspected she already knew the answer. "Oh, she's fine," Linda assured her. "She's not really used to big gatherings anymore, but she likes watching people. Don't worry about her." Margaret looked at Helen, who met her gaze with those kind, tired eyes. There was something in that look, something that made Margaret curious. This wasn't just a frail, elderly woman sitting at a party. There was depth there, history, stories that would never be told. The sound of the piano drew their attention back to the patio. Another guest was attempting something classical, though they quickly abandoned it when the notes proved too difficult, switching instead to a simpler tune. Everyone laughed good-naturedly. That's when Margaret had her idea. Maybe there was a way to make Helen feel more included, more a part of things. She turned to Linda with a smile. "Does your grandmother play piano?" she asked, nodding toward the instrument on the patio. Linda's expression changed. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or uncertainty. She turned to her grandmother and spoke in Mandarin, translating Margaret's question. Helen's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, tensed. Her eyes moved to the piano, and for just a moment, her careful, neutral expression cracked. What Margaret saw in that instant was complicated. Longing, sadness, fear, something deep and old and painful. Then Helen looked down and said something quietly in response. Linda turned back to Margaret with an apologetic smile. "She says she used to play a long time ago, but not anymore." Margaret's curiosity only grew stronger. There was something in the way Helen had looked at that piano, something that suggested more than just casual familiarity with the instrument. It was the look of someone who'd lost something precious. "How long ago?" Margaret asked gently. Linda spoke with her grandmother again, their conversation going back and forth in quiet Mandarin. Helen shook her head several times, her hands now gripping each other tightly. Linda's expression grew more serious as she listened to her grandmother's responses. "She studied piano in Moscow," Linda finally said, and Margaret could hear the surprise in her granddaughter's voice, as if this was news to her too. "At a conservatory there. She was very young, but she hasn't played in more than 40 years. Margaret felt her eyes widen. Moscow Conservatory. "That's one of the most prestigious music schools in the world," Linda nodded slowly. She seemed to be piecing together information she'd never fully understood before. "My grandmother grew up in Russia. I knew that, but she never talked much about her life there. She always said it was too painful to remember." Sounds of the party continued around them. Someone was playing Somewhere Over the Rainbow on the piano now, the notes sweet but simple. Children's laughter rang out from the far corner of the yard where they were playing tag. But in this small corner beneath the dogwood tree, the mood had shifted to something quieter, more intimate. Margaret knelt down beside Helen's bench, bringing herself to eye level with the elderly woman. Even though they couldn't speak the same language, she wanted to connect somehow. She placed her hand gently over Helen's and spoke slowly, hoping her tone would convey what her words couldn't. "Would you play something for us?" "Just one song?" Margaret asked, gesturing toward the piano Linda translated, and Helen immediately shook her head. She responded in rapid Mandarin, her voice quiet but firm. Linda listened, then sighed. "She says no, thank you. She says it's been too long. Her hands are too old now. She wouldn't remember how." But Margaret had seen that look in Helen's eyes when she first mentioned the piano. That wasn't the look of someone who'd forgotten. That was the look of someone who remembered too well. "Tell her the piano has just been restored," Margaret said, not quite ready to give up. "Tell her it would mean a lot to my husband if someone who really knows music would play it. He worked so hard on bringing it back to life." It was a gentle manipulation, Margaret knew, appealing to politeness and obligation. But something in her gut told her this mattered, that Helen needed to play perhaps more than Margaret needed to hear it. Linda hesitated, then translated. Helen's expression softened slightly at the mention of Robert's hard work. She looked across the lawn to where the piano sat, its polished surface reflecting the glow of the paper lanterns. The evening had deepened now. The sky was turning shades of purple and pink, and someone had turned on the string lights that crisscrossed the patio. The piano looked almost magical in that light. Like something from another time, Helen said something very quietly. So quietly that Linda had to lean in to hear her. "She says she's afraid," Linda translated, her own voice catching slightly. "She's afraid she won't be able to do it justice. She's afraid it will hurt too much." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. She squeezed Helen's hand gently. "Tell her it's just friends here. No judgment. No pressure. Just music." The three women sat together for a long moment. Around them, the party flowed on, oblivious to the small drama unfolding in their corner. Robert had taken over the piano again and was attempting something jazzy, though his timing was off. People were clapping anyway, enjoying the effort more than the execution. Then Helen took a deep breath and nodded once. Just a small movement of her head, but it was a yes. Linda's eyes went wide. "Grandma, are you sure?" Helen nodded again, more firmly this time. She said something in Mandarin that made Linda laugh despite the tension of the moment. "What did she say?" Margaret asked. Linda smiled. "She said that piano is too beautiful to waste on amateurs all night." Margaret couldn't help but laugh too. There was a spark of something in Helen's eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe a bit of her old spirit pushing through decades of silence. Helping Helen to her feet took a moment. The elderly woman moved carefully, her joints stiff from sitting. But once she was standing, she straightened her shoulders in a way that changed her entire bearing. She smoothed down her floral dress and patted her hair, primping as if preparing for something important. As they made their way across the lawn, toward the patio, a few people noticed and smiled politely, but most were caught up in their own conversations. Robert had just finished his jazz attempt and was standing by the piano, laughing with a group of neighbors about his mistakes. Margaret caught her husband's eye and waved him over. "Robert, this is Linda's grandmother, Helen. She studied at the Moscow Conservatory many years ago. She's agreed to play something on your piano." Robert's face lit up with genuine excitement. "Really? Oh, that's wonderful. Please, please, sit down. I'd be honored." He gestured to the piano bench with a flourish. His enthusiasm endearing and childlike, Helen moved toward the piano slowly. The small crowd that had been gathered around it stepped back, giving her space. A few people noticed something was happening and quieted down, but many guests were still engaged in their own conversations across the yard. Unaware that anything out of the ordinary was taking place, Helen stood beside the piano for a long moment, just looking at it. She reached out and ran her fingers along the edge of the keys, not pressing down, just feeling their smooth surface. Her hand was trembling slightly. Linda stood close by, looking worried. "Grandma, You don't have to do this if you don't want to.
Helen
Shook her head. She said something in Mandarin without looking away from the piano. What did she say? Margaret whispered. Linda's eyes were glistening. She said she needs to do this. She said she's been running away for too long. Helen finally sat down on the bench. She adjusted her position, moving slightly forward, then back, finding the right distance from the keys. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, and Margaret could see they were shaking more now. Whether from age, nervousness, or emotion, she couldn't tell. Probably all three. Robert, sensing something significant was about to happen, raised his voice to address the party. Everyone. Everyone, please. We have a special guest who's going to play for us. This is Helen, and she trained at one of the finest conservatories in Russia. More people turned their attention toward the patio now. Conversations began to die down, though plenty of guests were still chatting, still drinking, still caught up in their own little worlds. They'd heard amateur playing all evening. They had no reason to expect anything different now. Helen closed her eyes. Her trembling hands stilled for just a moment, hovering in the air above the keys. Margaret found herself holding her breath without knowing why. There was something about this moment, something charged and important in a way she couldn't quite name. Then Helen's hands descended to the keys. She pressed down tentatively, playing a few soft notes. They were careful, uncertain. The sound was pretty, but unremarkable. A few people smiled politely. Someone nearby continued their conversation at a lower volume. Helen paused. Her eyes were still closed. She took a long, slow breath, and her entire body seemed to shift. Her back straightened. Her shoulders settled. Her hands repositioned themselves on the keys with a sudden, surprising confidence, and then she began to play. The change was instantaneous and shocking. The tentative notes vanished, replaced by powerful, precise playing that filled the entire backyard. The music that poured from that piano wasn't amateur party entertainment. It was something else entirely. Something that reached inside your chest and grabbed hold. The few conversations that had continued immediately stopped. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Children stopped running mid-stride. Even the breeze seemed to pause. Everyone in that backyard turned toward the piano, and every single person fell absolutely silent. The music that came from that piano was unlike anything most people in that backyard had ever heard in person. It wasn't just notes being played. It was emotion given sound. It was a story being told without words. The piece Helen had chosen was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most challenging and beautiful pieces ever written for piano. Her fingers flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone her age. The opening measures were powerful, almost aggressive, demanding attention from every person present. But then the music would soften, becoming tender and heartbreaking before building again to moments of incredible intensity. Margaret stood frozen, her hand pressed against her chest. She could feel her heart pounding in rhythm with the music. Beside her, Robert had tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. He'd restored that piano hoping people would enjoy it, but he'd never imagined it could produce sound like this. It was as if the instrument had been waiting all these years for the right hands to touch it. Linda stood behind her grandmother, both hands covering her mouth. She'd known her grandmother had played piano once, but this was revelation. This was discovering that the quiet woman who made her soup and knitted scarves and watched television in the evening had once possessed this kind of gift, this kind of power around the yard. The reaction was the same everywhere. Complete stillness. Complete attention. A little girl who'd been running around all evening stood motionless near her father, her eyes wide. A man who'd been checking his phone had lowered it to his side, forgotten. Two women who'd been deep in conversation about their book club stood side by side, not looking at each other, both staring at the piano with expressions of wonder. Helen herself seemed transported. Her eyes remained closed, but her face was alive with emotion. As she played, tears began rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't stop. If anything, the music became more intense, more passionate. Her whole body moved with the piece, swaying slightly, her shoulders rising and falling. She was no longer an elderly woman at a suburban garden party. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere in her past. reliving something the rest of them could only glimpse through the music. The technical skill was breathtaking. Her fingers moved through impossible runs and complex chord progressions without hesitation. There were moments where both hands seemed to be playing completely independent melodies that somehow wove together into something greater than either could be alone. It was the kind of playing that required not just talent, but thousands upon thousands of hours of practice. The kind of playing that came from a lifetime of dedication, but more than the technical skill. It was the feeling in the music that held everyone captive. This wasn't a performance. This was something more intimate, more raw. It was as if Helen was pouring everything she'd kept locked inside for 40 years out through those keys. Every regret, every lost dream, every moment of beauty she'd been forced to leave behind. The music was joyful and tragic at the same time, speaking of youth and loss, passion and resignation. A few people in the crowd knew enough about music to recognize what they were hearing. Dennis, who played cello in a community orchestra, stood with his mouth actually hanging open. He knew how difficult this piece was. He knew that what they were witnessing was professional-level playing, conservatory-level playing. This wasn't some hobbyist who'd taken lessons as a child. This was someone who'd been trained to perform on the world's greatest stages. Patricia, who taught piano to children 3 days a week, felt something like awe mixed with humility. She'd been playing earlier in the evening, feeling proud of her Beatles medley. Now she understood the vast distance between someone who played piano and someone who truly mastered it. She would tell people later that in all her years of teaching and playing, she'd never heard anything so beautiful in a live setting. But most of the guests didn't have musical training. They couldn't name the piece or identify the specific techniques Helen was using. They just knew that something extraordinary was happening. They knew they were witnessing something they'd remember for the rest of their lives. Several people were crying without fully understanding why. The music reached something deep inside, touching places that words couldn't reach. The piece Helen was playing had several movements, and she played them all. Minutes stretched on, but nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Nobody even shifted their weight. The children, who'd been restless and energetic all evening, stood as still as statues. It was as if the entire gathering had fallen under a spell. As Helen played, the sky continued to darken. The paper lanterns glowed brighter in the growing dusk. Stars began to appear overhead. The music filled that space between day and night, between past and present, creating a moment that felt suspended outside of normal time. There were passages in the music that were so delicate they seemed fragile, like they might shatter if anyone breathed too loudly. Helen's touch on the keys became whisper-soft, drawing out notes that hung in the air like teardrops. Then the music would swell again, becoming powerful and triumphant. Her hands crashing down on the keys with controlled force that made the whole instrument resonate. Margaret found herself thinking about all the backyard parties she'd hosted over the years, the laughter and conversations, the casual enjoyment of good company. All of those evenings had been pleasant, comfortable, nice. This was something different. This was the kind of moment that changed how you saw the world. It reminded you that there was depth and beauty and tragedy all around you, hidden in unexpected places, in quiet people you might never really notice. She looked around at her neighbors and friends, all these familiar faces, and saw them transformed by the music. She saw the investment banker who usually talked about nothing but golf with tears on his cheeks. She saw the teenager who'd been glued to her phone all evening watching Helen with complete focus. She saw strangers united in this shared experience, this moment of pure beauty. Robert couldn't take his eyes off his piano. He'd bought it on a whim, spent months bringing it back to life, never fully knowing why it mattered so much to him. Now he knew. It was for this. That piano had been waiting for Helen, and Helen had been waiting for the piano. Some things in life were meant to find each other as the music built toward its conclusion. The intensity became almost unbearable. Helen's hands flew across the keys in cascading runs that seemed to tumble over each other like water over rocks. Her whole body was engaged now, leaning into the instrument, drawing every possible ounce of sound from it. The melody soared, reaching for something just beyond grasp. expressing a longing so profound it made your chest ache. And then, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, Helen played the final notes. They rang out clear and perfect into the evening air, then slowly faded into silence. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment, then slowly lifted and came to rest in her lap. She sat very still, her eyes still closed, her face wet with tears. Her breathing was heavy, as if she'd just run a great distance. The silence that followed was absolute. 50 people stood in that backyard, and not one of them made a sound. The moment stretched. Nobody wanted to break it. It felt sacred somehow, that silence after such music. It felt like waking from a profound dream and needing a moment to remember where you were. Then Helen opened her eyes. She looked down at her hands as if surprised to find them there, surprised to find herself sitting at a piano in a stranger's backyard. She blinked slowly, seeming confused about what had just happened, and that's when the spell broke. Someone started clapping, and within a heartbeat everyone was applauding. But it wasn't polite party applause. It was thunderous, emotional, overwhelming. People weren't just clapping their hands together. They were expressing something bigger than simple appreciation. The applause seemed to startle Helen. She looked up at the crowd gathering around the piano, and for a moment she seemed almost frightened by all the attention. Her hands began to tremble again, but this time it was different. This time, it was the overwhelming emotion of being truly seen after decades of invisibility. Linda rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her grandmother from behind, both of them crying now. Helen reached up and patted her granddaughter's hands, saying something softly in Mandarin that nobody else could hear. People pressed closer, many of them with tears still wet on their faces. They wanted to say something, to thank her, to express what they'd just experienced, but words felt inadequate. How do you thank someone for giving you a glimpse of something transcendent? Robert was the first to speak, his voice shaky with emotion. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life. Thank you. Thank you for bringing my piano to life like that. Helen looked at him and seemed to understand the gratitude in his voice, even if she couldn't understand all the words. She nodded, managing a small smile through her tears. Dennis, the cellist, pushed forward slightly. Ma'am, I play in an orchestra. I've heard professional pianists perform that piece. What you just did was extraordinary. Where did you train? How long did you study? Linda translated the questions to her grandmother, and Helen's expression shifted. The moment of grace seemed to crack slightly, and underneath was something harder, something painful. She spoke quietly in response, her words coming slowly at first, then faster. As if a dam had broken inside her, Linda listened, her own face changing as she heard the story. When Helen finished speaking, there was a long moment of silence before Linda could find the words to translate. My grandmother says she studied at the Moscow Conservatory starting when she was 7 years old, Linda began, her voice thick with emotion. She was identified as a prodigy very young. Piano was her entire life. She practiced 8, sometimes 10 hours a day. She lived and breathed music. The crowd listened in complete silence. Even the children had grown still, sensing something important was being shared. By the time she was 16, she was performing in competitions across Russia. She won several prestigious awards. Her teachers told her she would have an international career, that she would perform in the great concert halls of the world. She was being prepared for exactly that. Linda paused, struggling with her emotions. Helen sat at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. The party lights cast gentle shadows across her face. But then everything changed, Linda continued. Her father was a journalist. He wrote articles that criticized the government. This was during the Soviet era, when such things were very dangerous. One day, men came and took him away. Her family was labeled as enemies of the state. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Around her, she could see similar reactions on other faces. People who'd been strangers an hour ago now shared in this moment of collective grief for a woman they'd just met. My grandmother was 17 when they told her she could no longer attend the conservatory, Linda said, her voice breaking. She was forbidden from performing publicly. Her teachers were instructed not to work with her anymore. Everything she'd worked for her entire life was taken away in a single day because of her father's beliefs. Helen said something else, and Linda nodded, wiping her eyes before translating. She says the hardest part wasn't losing her career. It was losing the music itself. For years, she couldn't bring herself to play even in private. Every time she sat at a piano, all she could feel was the loss. It was too painful. Patricia, the piano teacher, spoke up gently. But surely later, after you left Russia, you could have played again. Linda translated, and Helen responded with a long explanation, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. When she finished, Linda took a deep breath before sharing the rest. She eventually married my grandfather, who was Chinese. They left Russia together in the early 1980s and settled in Beijing. By then, she'd gone 20 years without seriously playing. She'd convinced herself that part of her life was over, that she was a different person now. She had children, then grandchildren. She became a mother and grandmother, and that was enough. Or at least that's what she told herself. She moved to Oregon after my grandfather passed away 5 years ago, Linda continued. She's been living there alone until a few months ago when I convinced her to come stay with me. All this time, all these years living in America, I knew she'd studied music in Russia. But I never knew she'd been that good. She never told me. She never told anyone. Helen spoke again, and this time there was something different in her voice. Something that sounded almost like wonder. She says she hasn't touched a piano in over 40 years, Linda translated, looking at her grandmother with amazement. Not once. Until tonight? The crowd absorbed this information in stunned silence. 40 years? An entire lifetime for some of the younger people present. Helen had carried this gift inside her for 4 decades, never expressing it, never sharing it, letting it lie dormant like a seed buried too deep to ever reach sunlight. Why tonight? Someone asked. What made you decide to play tonight? Helen listened to the translation and thought for a long moment before responding. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. Linda translated carefully. She says she's not sure. When Mrs. Henderson asked her to play, her first instinct was to refuse, like she's been refusing for 40 years. But then she looked at that beautiful piano sitting there under the lights, and she thought about how it had been restored. How someone had taken something old and neglected and brought it back to life, and she wondered if maybe it wasn't too late for her either. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face now. She wasn't alone. All around the patio, people were crying openly, moved by this story of loss and rediscovery, of a gift nearly lost forever. Robert knelt beside the piano bench, looking up at Helen. I'm so grateful you chose my piano for this. I had no idea when I invited you to play what I was asking. Thank you for having the courage to say yes. Helen reached out and patted his cheek gently, the way you might comfort a child. She said something in Russian this time, not Mandarin. The words were soft and melodic. What did she say? Robert asked Linda. Linda shook her head. I don't speak Russian. I'm sorry, but Dennis, the cellist, stepped forward. Do! I studied there for a summer program years ago. He looked at Helen with deep respect. She said music doesn't die. It just waits. The simplicity and truth of those words settled over the gathering. Music doesn't die. It just waits. For the right moment, the right invitation, the right courage to let it out again. People began asking questions then, wanting to know more. What was it like studying at the conservatory? What other pieces did she know? Had she ever played with an orchestra? Helen answered some questions through Linda's translation, but she was growing tired. The performance had taken everything out of her, emotionally and physically. Margaret noticed Helen's exhaustion and gently suggested that everyone give her some space. There's still food and drinks, she announced to the crowd. Let's let Helen rest a bit. People slowly dispersed, though they kept glancing back at the piano, at the small, elderly woman who'd just revealed herself to be so much more than anyone had imagined. Small groups formed, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Everyone wanting to talk about it, but a few people stayed close. Dennis pulled out his phone and asked, through Linda, if Helen would be willing to play again sometime, perhaps at a community center where he sometimes performed. Patricia asked if she could bring some of her advanced students to hear Helen play. Others offered similar invitations, opportunities, connections. Helen listened to all of this with a mixture of bewilderment and something that might have been hope. Linda squeezed her grandmother's hand. "You don't have to decide anything tonight, Grandma," she said in Mandarin. "Just rest." But Helen shook her head. She spoke firmly, with more energy than she'd shown all evening. "What did she say?" Margaret asked. Linda smiled through fresh tears. She said yes, to all of it. She said she's wasted enough time already. The party continued for another hour after Helen's performance. But it had transformed into something completely different. The casual, festive atmosphere had given way to something deeper. People weren't just making small talk anymore. They were having real conversations about dreams they'd given up, talents they'd let slip away, parts of themselves they'd buried under the weight of practical life. Helen remained on the patio, surrounded by a small but constant group of people who wanted to connect with her. Even with the language barrier, something had shifted. She was no longer the quiet, invisible elderly woman sitting alone in the corner. She was seen now, truly seen. And despite her exhaustion, there was a light in her eyes that Linda had never witnessed before. Before people began leaving, at least a dozen guests approached Helen with personal stories. A man named Vincent confessed that he'd wanted to be a painter, but had gone into banking instead because it was practical. A woman named Joyce admitted she used to write poetry but hadn't put pen to paper in 20 years. A young father said he'd played guitar in a band during college and couldn't remember the last time he'd picked up his instrument. Helen listened to each person through Linda's translations, and she would nod knowingly, as if to say, "I understand. I know what it's like to lose yourself." She would pat their hands or squeeze their shoulders, and somehow these simple gestures carried weight. Here was someone who'd lost everything and found it again. If she could do it at 77, maybe it wasn't too late for them either. When the last guests finally departed, Margaret insisted that Linda and Helen stay for a cup of tea. They sat together in the kitchen while Robert carefully closed the piano lid, treating the instrument with even more reverence than before, as if it had become sacred. "I don't even know what to say," Margaret admitted. Pouring hot water into delicate china cups, "I invited you to play, thinking it would be a nice gesture, a way to include you. I had no idea." Linda laughed softly. "Neither did I. My grandmother has always been so quiet, so reserved. I knew she'd studied music, but she made it sound like casual lessons. Nothing serious. She never mentioned being a prodigy. She never mentioned any of this." Helen sipped her tea slowly, looking tired but peaceful. She said something in Mandarin, and Linda translated. She says she was ashamed. For 40 years she felt like a failure. She had this gift, and she let it die. She thought if people knew what she'd once been, they would judge her for wasting it. But it wasn't her fault, Margaret protested. She had everything taken from her. "I know," Linda said. "But shame doesn't always make sense." She carried this guilt all these years, feeling like she'd betrayed something precious. The music, her teachers, her younger self who'd worked so hard. It was easier to just bury it all and pretend she was someone else. Robert joined them at the kitchen table, his eyes still red from crying. "What made you keep going back then?" he asked Helen through Linda. "After they kicked you out of the conservatory, after everything was taken away, how did you survive that?" Helen thought for a long moment before answering. Linda translated carefully. She says music was the only language she spoke fluently. When they took it away, she felt mute. She went through the motions of living, got married, raised children, but a part of her was always silent. She thought that silence would last until she died. "And now?" Margaret asked gently. Helen's response brought tears to Linda's eyes as she translated. Now she says she feels like she can breathe again, like she's been holding her breath for 40 years and finally let it out. Over the next few weeks, word of Helen's performance spread far beyond that backyard. Dennis kept his promise and arranged for Helen to play at a small community concert. Patricia brought her advanced students to Linda's apartment, where Helen had started practicing on a keyboard Robert had insisted on buying for her. One of the party guests worked for the local newspaper and wrote a feature story about the mysterious Russian pianist who'd emerged from 4 decades of silence. The newspaper article changed everything. It was picked up by a regional magazine, then shared thousands of times on social media. News outlets began reaching out. A classical radio station wanted to interview her. A retired conductor who lived 2 towns over contacted Linda, offering to work with Helen if she wanted to prepare for more formal performances. Linda's small apartment became a hub of activity. Musicians would stop by to meet Helen, to hear her play, to learn her story. Some came out of curiosity, but most came away changed. There was something powerful about witnessing someone reclaim a lost part of themselves. Something that gave people permission to look at their own abandoned dreams. Helen practiced every day now, sometimes for hours. Her technique, which had been flawless even after 40 years away from the piano, became even more refined. But more importantly, she began to smile while she played. The pain that had marked her first performance began to transform into something else. Joy mixed with sorrow, loss balanced with gratitude. 3 months after the garden party, Helen gave her first formal concert at a small performing arts center in a neighboring town. The venue held 200 people, and every seat was filled. Margaret and Robert sat in the front row. Dennis was there with his wife. Patricia brought her entire studio of piano students, but most of the audience were strangers who'd heard about the Russian pianist with the impossible story. Linda stood backstage with her grandmother before the performance. Helen wore a simple black dress, her silver hair carefully arranged. She looked nervous but determined. "Are you scared?" Linda asked in Mandarin. Helen nodded, terrified. But it's a different kind of fear than before. Before, I was afraid of the pain. Now I'm afraid I'll wake up and discover this was all a dream. "It's not a dream, Grandma," Linda assured her. "You did this. You came back." Helen took her granddaughter's hands. "No, I didn't do this alone. That woman, Margaret, she asked me to play. She gave me permission to try. Sometimes all we need is someone to ask, someone to believe we still have something to offer." The concert was remarkable. Helen played several pieces, including the Rachmaninoff that had started it all. But she also played Chopin, Debussy, and a Russian folk melody she'd learned as a child. Each piece was performed with the technical mastery of a trained professional and the emotional depth of someone who'd lived through profound loss and found her way back. When she finished, the standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. People weren't just applauding the performance. They were celebrating something bigger. The resilience of the human spirit. The idea that it's never too late. That the parts of ourselves we think are dead might just be sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. After the concert, an elderly man approached Helen with tears in his eyes, through broken English and gestures. He managed to communicate that he'd been a violinist once but had stopped playing after his wife died. Watching Helen had made him want to try again, a middle-aged woman told Linda. She'd been a dancer before injuries ended her career. She'd spent 20 years convinced that chapter of her life was closed forever. Now she was thinking about teaching, about finding another way to stay connected to dance, taught story after story, person after person, all touched by Helen's journey in their own way. The local news did a follow-up piece 6 months later. They found Helen teaching piano twice a week at a community center, giving free lessons to children who couldn't afford private instruction. She'd also started performing regularly at nursing homes and retirement communities, bringing music to people who rarely got to experience live performances. "Why do you do this?" the reporter asked through an interpreter. "You could charge for lessons. You could perform at bigger venues." Helen's answer was simple. "I lost 40 years because I believed it was too late, because I thought I had nothing left to offer. I don't want anyone else to make that mistake. If my story helps even one person pick up something they've lost, then those 40 years weren't wasted." Margaret kept a photo from the garden party on her piano. It showed Helen at the keyboard, her eyes closed, her hands suspended over the keys in that moment right before she began to play. Whenever guests asked about it, Margaret would tell the whole story, never getting tired of sharing it. "That night changed all of us," she would say. "We thought we were just having a regular party. We had no idea we were about to witness someone come back to life." Robert would add, "I restored that piano thinking I was saving an old instrument. Turns out the piano was saving someone else." Linda eventually convinced her grandmother to record an album. It was released by a small independent label and sold modestly, mostly to people who knew Helen's story. But for those who listened, it was a powerful reminder that art isn't just about entertainment. It's about survival, about holding on to the things that make us human, about refusing to let the essential parts of ourselves disappear completely. Helen never became famous. She never performed at Carnegie Hall or toured internationally like she might have in another life. But in her mid-70s, she found something perhaps more valuable. She found peace. She found purpose. She found proof that the music had been waiting all along, just like she'd said. And sometimes, late at night, when Linda couldn't sleep, she'd hear her grandmother playing softly in the next room. Not practicing, not performing,